After e4, d6, d5, d4, and then g6. In the first video, we went through knight f6, early in f6. In this case, we're going through early g6 and then fianchetto. So white now immediately plays h4, and after bishop to g7, white continues with h5. That's how we fight against the Pirc. And of course, taking here is silly for multiple reasons. So after knight to f6, white now continues with h6, attacking the bishop. Bishop is forced to go to f8, and white now continues with knight c3, defending the pawn in e4. So a lot of things we said in the first video. The first video is very useful for you to understand so many things about the structure of the Pirc, so please go watch that before you go into this. As explained in the first video, you can't play e5 already. So after knight to d7, the idea of playing e5. Well, let's actually go through e5 here anyway, because after e5, we can take, and after take, white continues with knight f3, attacking the bishop. And after bishop to d6, which is an idea that I've seen in the past, sometimes since the black player realizes that he can't really ever develop the bishop from this side, he goes to d6, which is fair enough. But white now plays bishop g5, attacking the knight, and after knight d7, defending it, knight to d5, putting pressure on it. Bishop has to return to e7, and now white can take it. King takes, and now long castle. It's a masterpiece of development, proper Paul Morphy's type of game. Rook to e8. Now white can sacrifice the rook in d7, and after bishop takes back, knight can take in e5. The idea of course after taking will be to take back, and so white will be up in material. So after rook a to d8, white takes as well, because after rook takes back, e5 recaptures the material. So from the beginning, h4 is played immediately during the fianchetto opening, then h5, knight f6, and then attacking the bishop, bishop f8, knight c3. What happens after bishop g4? This is something that I've seen plenty of times as well. It's very popular. White continues with f3. As mentioned in the first video of the how to defeat the Pirc, the bishop will have a feature on such a diagonal rather than on the king side for many reasons. So after the bishop goes back, white continues bishop g5. Threatening to attack the knight with the pawn, and then the knight will be forced back, which would be ridiculous. So after e5, trying to block the center for black, knight d5, putting pressure, and after bishop e7, knight takes, queen takes, and now white continues with queen d2. Taking in d4 is met by queen to d4, and white wins. A move like knight to c6 looks like normal development. This is met by d5, attacking the knight. And a knight to d8 is met by long castle. White's advantage is crashing. Knight to d4 is not possible because c3 traps it. So instead of that move, knight c6, what if white plays pawn to c6? Idea potentially to play knight a7, a6 and then c7, and then eventually e6. White continues with long castle, and after b5, which makes sense since the white player might think now that the files are closed on the king side, black could just castle short and then throw stuff against the queen side. White's best move is queen to e1. This would be a very strong attack from h4. So after best move, which is queen to e6, I'm pinning the knight. White continues bishop to h4. The idea of pushing the g4 pawn at some point. So after castling, white's best move is knight to e2. And now there's many things that the black player can try to do. A few of them make sense. If black really wants to move the queen somewhere, make use of the best piece, is going to have to remove this knight from this square because it's being attacked. So after knight to h5, a potential idea of reaching f4. How do we deal with this? d5 in this situation. We want to dismantle the queenside pawns because there's many of them, of course, and they're all coming towards our king. So if we get to take one of them and open the file for the rook, then this attack of these two pawns will be much weaker. At the same time, it also depends on what black does. That is just an idea. Taking this pawn will allow these two pawns to be on their own, so they're kind of weak. And best move by black is queen to e8, possibly transferring the queen and also giving more defense over c6. White's best move now is g4. And after knight to f4, how do we deal with this? Well, the advantage isn't really arriving only now with the last moves, because there could have been some imperfect moves. The advantage has been like all along, because the early g6 and bishop g7 variation of the periods are not good, because it's just going to keep pushing the pawn in h and create an attack. Knight can take in f4, pawn takes back, and now bishop to f6 to stop the pawn, the f4 pawn from moving. The idea now, unstoppable, is to play queen to c3. This bishop will be incredibly strong in defending the whole diagonal. So idea of bishop h8 and obvious follow-up. Funny thing, this is unstoppable, and white's position is evaluated as +7. The beginning, early g6 and then h4, bishop g7, h5, knight f6 and then h6, bishop f8, and knight c3. So finally we are right when we started at the beginning of the video. What happens after knight to d7? The move we were gonna go through. White continues with the crucial move, g4. Idea of playing g5. We want to paralyze the king side completely. Black will not be able to move any of these pieces around the king side. So after e5, white plays g5, and then the knight will have to go to g8. So after knight to g8, white continues bishop to e3. This game has become a joke already. Black's only way to develop the bishop will be to e7, but then knight to f3 to put more defense over g5. And white will eventually find a way to castle alongside, and white is completely dominating this game. There's going to be too many lines, and as I say all the time, I can't really go through all the trillions of variations possible. Black could play anything, you know, like, but the thing is that most of these moves will be completely useless. The important thing is to understand the principles. Like here, what's going on in the game? Black just can't move the knight in g8 and the rook in h8 forever. It literally just can't do it ever. And so it's up to you to build a plan that wins the game. All you need to do is just do queen d2, long castle, and then open up the files, for instance. Let's have a look at moves that look natural and very human, so that when we face them, we know what's wrong with them. f6 looks like a normal move, very human type of move, because gives a place for the king to go. Potentially also suggests a swap the knight can develop, and black can think of castling, and if not, anyway, it's adding pressure to a g5, and black will want to take. And the g5 pawn cannot be backed up by another pawn. So that means that it seems like these two pawns in there are not going to last forever. White continues to queen to g2, putting more defense. Two options here. Black can think of pushing f5 or simply take. After takes, that's a mistake, because bishop c4 and knight g5 will be just too strong, unstoppable actually. So if black plays knight f6, knight g5 wins. He can't stop knight e6 or simply knight f7. If black plays bishop f6, then again knight to g5. The threat is too strong, so after bishop takes g5, bishop takes g5. And now the queen can't move, so after knight finally develops, white continues with the crashing f4. The idea is to take the pawns and eventually take the knight because it's pinned. So after pawn takes f4, or best move by black, only move basically, e5 finally, and after pawn takes e5 even, we can finally take back. Taking will run into queen takes and then bishop check, winning everything. So in this position, knight f6, bishop f6 don't work because of too many threats. What happens after pawn takes in d4? Bishop takes comes with an attack on the rook, and after knight to e5, which kind of stops all of the previous threat, because the knight's attacking the bishop with an attack on the queen eventually, threatening also the knight with a threat of a fork. So white is forced to take the knight in e5. Pawn takes back, and now queen e3, holding pressure over g5, allowing maybe rook e1, rook d1. And if the best move by black, queen d6, so the queen can reach some freedom, rook to d1, and now queen c5, looking for swaps. This can be even accepted because black's pawn structure is ruined. So you can argue that the black player has been able to relieve himself from the huge pressure on the king side, and now he's able to use all of his pieces like normally. Maybe the bishop can go out, this bishop has got freedom, the rook will go out next move. So you can see that the black player has managed to get out of that. But the problem is that after knight to e5, white's pieces are just too well placed. Knight to f6 in order to allow some freedom to the black rook, otherwise he gets trapped. Knight f7, it still doesn't work because rook f8, and I will finally playing rook to d8 check. King has to move. And now rook check, king takes, finally recapture the pawn in g5. And after e5 we will be winning the pawn in h7, and this passed pawn will be key to victory. What happens after two developing moves? One of them can be bishop to d7, which is met by e5. Just see an example of how this works. Knight to g4 looks like an obvious move. Knight h7 check, king can't really go anywhere here, so king e8, knight f6 check, forces a trade and reduces any initiative of the black player. In this position, if instead of bishop d7 black played bishop to g4 for instance, then the move is rook to h4, still the threat of attacking the knight and then the bishop being able to be taken. And then after rook e8, just in order to develop the last piece that hasn't been developed, then simply knight h7 can be played even. So yeah, e5 cannot be played anymore because the rook was guarding it, but you can just play knight h7 check, swap everything, and this is a winning endgame. So from the beginning, h4 and then bishop h5, knight, and then h6, bishop f8, knight c3, and knight to d7. This is met by g4. We've seen this incredible move after e5, g5, and after knight is forced to g8 for reasons we have seen before. Bishop e3, bishop going to the only developing square, knight f3 to defend the crucial g5 pawn, and now f6, the only move to try and be able to use the pieces on the king side. After queen d2, we're going to look at, we saw everything that happens after pawn takes. What happens after f5? The idea of going to f4. Well, obviously now we have to take because f4 will be too strong. Pawn takes back, and now we can take in e5. And after knight takes back, it looks like the black player has been able to finally simplify the game, and he's also of course looking for his, well, this is a fork, but he's looking for a swap so that we can go in a queenless endgame, and black will be happy because in a game where he's being put under so much pressure, because players from every rating that play the Pirc, that play the early g6 and bishop g7, they don't really know this because this is a computer line. If you memorize this, you'll have a great advantage all the time. Bishop e2 is the best move for white. Defends the knight and prepares queen d4. So after b6, for instance, preparing the bishop to attack, to put more pressure over the knight and go into a very good diagonal, also because the bishop doesn't have a future from this diagonal. Queen d4, increases the pressure over the square e5. Bishop b7 is met by knight e5, so this is to remember. Taking the knight is not good because of queen e5, and this is threatening bishop h5 check, and when the king moves, queen g7, and also where the king goes this way, then still a lot of other different type of trouble. So if instead black takes in h1, then again check, king moves, white now plays knight to d7 check, and there is no other move but to take the knight, and this is followed by queen g7. From the beginning, g6, h4. What happens if when black plays the immediate h5 move in order to stop all of that? White plays knight f3, and after bishop to g4, queen to d3 is the best move. Immediately I'm pinning the knight. So after bishop to g7, black is now planning to finally go on with the natural development of the Pirc. There is a pawn in d6 since the first move, so black wants to have, he will have to play the bishop on the diagonal here. Now white can play knight to g5, knight to f6, all looking like normal moves. But now, how do we punish the early arrival of the bishop in g4? Queen to b3, attacking b7, and also attacking the square in f7. So after castling, best move by black, only move basically, queen b7 and knight d7, it looks like black could have some compensation of development. White now plays pawn to f3, attacking the bishop, and the bishop is forced to e6. And now it's very tricky because d5 looks very tempting, but it's wrong because knight c5 attacks the queen, and when the queen moves, the bishop will be able to go, and this is not good for white. So best move by white now is queen to a6. And besides, white is still threatening to take the bishop anyway. So after knight to b6, trying to save the bishop, white now is forced to take. Well, because black is planning to move the bishop away, now white is forced to take. Pawn takes back, and now c3 to build a good pawn chain in the center. And white is simply up a pawn for nothing. After c5 thematic move there to undermine the control of white of the center and potentially open files for the rooks. White continues with development bishop e2, and after take, black continues rook to c8, attacking the bishop. Bishop to e3, best move by white. So again, this is like we are out of theory, we've been out of theory for a bit, but this is just how to continue in such a scenario. This is the Pirc game where they play the early g6, the fianchetto, but they also play the early h5 move to stop the arrival of our pawn all the way up. We will continue this game with the bishop pair and with a very safe pawn structure, better pawn structure, a more active queen, and we have punished the mistake of early development of the light square bishop. A move like e5 is met by d5. e6, which is a move that black might try to play in order to challenge the massive control of the center that white has. Well, we can take it after queen e7, white castles, that's the best move, queen e6, and now knight to c3. White's development is over. The advantage is that black has a backwards pawn in d6, is down a pawn, and white has the bishop pair. So this is definitely an endgame you are happy to play. So let's see what happens after black tries to fight back. d5 threatening d4 is simply taken, and after knight takes back, looks like this is going towards a normal endgame. Knight takes, the knight cannot take because it's pinned, so after queen takes, now the queen can take in a7, and there's really nothing, there's really no compensation. Last thing we're going to point out is that in the early g6 variation we say we're going to play g4, h4. What happens when they play knight f6 now, in this crucial moment, which stops us from playing h5, it's also attacking h4, e4, white continues with knight c3, and now bishop g7, it has stopped our h5 plan basically, because the h5 plan comes when they play the bishop immediately, and you can just play h5 because you've got nothing to worry about this pawn. But in this case, after when they play knight f6, right in that moment, one move before playing bishop to g7, then we cannot play h5. What's the move here? It's f3. After castling, it looks like the black player has played the right combination of moves in the perfect timing of moves in order not to be annihilated right away. White continues with bishop to e3. What happens after c5? Now we can take the pawn. This is a thematic move you can take, and after take, then you can take. Looks like black's got some activity. There's nothing to worry really. White's attacking the pawn in e7, so after e6, bishop to d3, white is just better. Knight to d7, attacking the bishop and trying to develop. Bishop e7, rook e8, forcing moves. Bishop to d6. So after the only way to develop the bishop from the only good diagonal, which is b6, white plays bishop to b5, and after bishop to b7, e5 should do. That means the bishop b7 was not possible. The rook couldn't move. This rook would be attacked once again. e5 remains a threat, and white should be able to just simply develop. Potential ideas of g4, h5 are to be taken into account. So in this position, c5 was not good. What happens after knight c6? Normal move, queen d2, and e5. White continues with d5. A very similar scenario was seen in the previous video. Knight to e7, and now white can play g4. The idea is to remove as many of these pawns in the king side. What happens after c6? This looks like a very human move. The idea is, of course, to reduce the control of the center of the white player. White can carry on and play h5. If pawn takes, we can take back. Black isn't really interested in smashing his own king side, so after b6, inevitably white is going to play bishop to h6. And the position here is evaluated almost +3 for white. The idea, of course, is to reach the h6 square with the queen and then play pawn takes, with allowing the attack of the rook over the file. If the king were to move, then bishop g5 will be a very strong move because he's threatening to trap the bishop. It's a pattern to remember. And if the rook moves in order to unpin the bishop, maybe play bishop h8, then pawn takes here is very strong because you're threatening to take, and then queen will have access with the protection of the rook. So in this position, c5 doesn't work, knight c6 doesn't work. What happens after knight d7? Same thing, queen d2, and after e5, long castle. After a6, white continues with a6 white because of b5 b4, which is typical in this position. I mean, black is never going to attack from the king side. That's ridiculous. It's going to have to attack the queen side. So after h5 and knight h5, what happens now is bishop to g5, attack on the queen. And of course, opening the f pawn is just too weakening because you've got this incredible strong bishop. After the knight goes back, for instance, how do we deal with this? Pawn takes. And a very similar scenario was seen in the first video. Knight takes is met by f4, and then f5 is coming anyway, and we have too much pressure over d8. Whereas pawn takes e5, this is met by g4. After queen e8, which allows the black player to be able to move the knight in e7, and then the lights for bishop. White continues with queen to h2, and after h5, also because white is threatening to take the knight, and then if bishop takes, then h7 is accessible, and if knight takes, g5 should win material. Maybe not immediately, but still, after h5, pawn takes, and knight takes back, which is possible because the queen is no longer there in d8. White continues with knight to d5, threatening the square c7 and winning material. This is unstoppable. And also after knight to c7, the attack on the queen plus the squares that this bishop is attacking will trap it. So after knight to b8, in order to allow the queen a way out, knight check, king h8, and now white simply plays knight to e2, bringing one of the other pieces that haven't been developed yet into the game. And the idea is, of course, to go and pressure this knight in h5 and win. After knight to c6, for instance, redeveloping the knight and trying to get rid of this monster knight. Still knight to g3. So the queen still couldn't have gone anywhere else. And even if instead of moving, well, okay, knight c6 is met by knight taking h5 and then knight e7. isn't going anywhere. White wins after the discover check, right? That's clear for everyone. But even if the queen had moved like somewhere like queen a4 or something, this just doesn't prevent white from winning this game because of the h file.